to introduce you to Dr. Gillian Marsh, who is a Anyamathana. Let me know if I butchered that. Please do correct me if I butchered it. Traditional owner who is currently working as a lecturer in Indigenous Studies at Victoria University, and her PhD thesis dealt with the imposition of uranium mining on the sort of Indigenous country by General Atomics in collusion with the South Australian government. Welcome. And we also have Daniel Selwyn, who works with the London Mining Network and is author of their report, Marshall Mining. And I first discovered Daniel at a conference for Campaign Against the Arms Trade in the UK, in a panel on this real human security that I was talking about earlier. So welcome to Daniel as well. I've forgotten which one of you is to speak first. Is Gillian up first?
I am, yes.
Brilliant. I know you've got some slides for us as well, so I will let you take it away.
All right, good, thank you. Okay, shortly I'll share my slides, but first of all, I'd just like to give a brief acknowledgement. And I start off by saying that in Yurangawana, the language of the group that I come from, Adyamatna. And so I'd like to just say, Nanga Noran, Ngai Michi Gillian Marsh, Ngatu Adyamatna Uratu, Ngai Yarta Flinders Ranges, South Australia, Inari Kulin Yarta. And what I'm saying to you is, greetings everyone, my name is Gillian Marsh. I'm an Adyamatna woman from the Flinders Ranges region of South Australia, and I'm acknowledging my presence on Kulin country. And now I'd just like to share the screen with you, and I'll give you a short presentation. So is that coming up? Yes, I am sharing screen. Okay, good, that's working. I can't see it coming up. Why can't I see it coming up?
We can see you, Gillian. If you
can you see my screen though?
Yep. Yeah.
Oh, you can. Okay. All right. So you can see my slideshow here.
Yeah, we've got them.
Okay, good. All right. That's good. Okay, so I'd also like to say that before I go any further, that I also have some ancestral connections to Scotland. So my on one side of my family, on my mother's side, the Adyamatna side of my family, her family, her parents had different names, different last names. One was Mackenzie and the other one was Coulthard. And I'm aware that they're both Scottish names. And also on my father's side, my non-Aboriginal side of the family, my father's side is connected to Scotland as well through the MacDougall clan. So one day, hopefully, I'll get to Scotland and meet some of my relations over in Scotland. So firstly, I'd like to share some voices here. This comes directly from the many years that I've spent talking to people in my community about our concerns of this terrible thing that we have in the context of the nuclear industry. And of course, I'm talking about the fact that we have uranium ore in our country in several pockets. And so these are the types of things that people have talked about over the years and shared with me. And so one of the first things that they've made very clear and very consistently said is that this stuff that they call uranium now is part of our mura. It's part of our knowledge, it's part of our history, it's part of our connection to the country, and it's also part of our knowledge of creation. So Mutana is a spiritual connection that we have, and Mutana is the creation or the cosmology that's attached to our culture. And one of the things that I remember my mother saying to me about one of these pockets where there's uranium in our country, and the place is now called Akarula, and it's named after Akura, the serpent, the giant snake that created the underground water channels. Akarula Uchuveni Angoliata, that means it's very spiritual country. And that means that we have to look after the country, we have a responsibility to the country, and this has always been our responsibility, this is who we are. And one of the other quotes that came to me when I was doing my research was, one person said to me that old people have secret things around there near Beverley Mine, and also the creek at Beverley 4 Mile. They're both very big spiritual places, and often people will just say there's a big mura there, and that means that it's very sacred country, it's very old country, and we have a very big responsibility to look after it. And so my case study that I looked at in my PhD work was the case study of the Beverley uranium mine in Adnyamathanha country, and I completed that in 2010 at the University of Adelaide. And so from here on, I'm going to continue sharing some of my personal cultural knowledge, and also what I gained from doing the actual PhD work. So there were two components of my thesis work. I looked at Adnyamathanha experiences of community governance and how much pressure that's been subjected to, particularly since we've had a native title, the legislation, and also then the registration process of claims, and the that being another disruption to the way that community governance takes place. And also looking at the impact assessment, the government regulatory process. So looking at things like licensing obligations here in Australia, and also world's best practice, and whether or not in fact Australia are abiding by world's best practice. So looking at corporate social responsibility, we can think very clearly through this from a practical, experiential point of view, but also by looking at what's in the literature. And one of the first things that is very prominent, very consistent, is that there's a continuous denial of First Nations people's sovereign rights in this country. That has continued on since this country was first invaded, where our sovereignty has been dismissed, erased, wiped out. And this is part of the strategic alliance that continues between government and industry, such as the nuclear industry. And particularly in South Australia, and something that Annie Sue mentioned earlier, it's attached to this mentality of South Australia being founded on the basis of this is a wasteland area. It's only good as a wasteland zone. That's how it was first labelled when it was founded by the British invaders. And so negotiation with selected individuals, and also doing that in a way that suits the industry, suits government, and follows a track history of who are the right people to go to for industry and government, who are the ones who are going to come on board with this, or who are the ones who are going to be vulnerable when we approach them, and who are the ones that are going to make up the dissenting voices. And so lack of full disclosure about contractual arrangements and just understanding is something that for us as Adnyamathanha people, and particularly for my older generation of people, have really struggled with. We've really struggled with Yurungawala being the first language of many of people like my mother's age, and also Wudnyangawala, and that's the English language, also being the language that's used to create all this technical jargon that even ordinary Australian people who have English as their first language can barely understand, let alone people who are barely literate in written English and have only got basic literacy in spoken English. So corporate social responsibility is supposed to address, you would think, these basic things, but they haven't. And right at the highest level, even when we think back to when we had the Royal Commission into the nuclear fuel cycle, it was very clearly stated that this discussion, this debate requires technical language. If you can't understand it, well, shut up. That was basically the message we got. So best practice on a global as well as local scale, we're not seeing much best practice from a local scale. And as I discovered through the course of my PhD work, we didn't see much in the way of best practice and compliance at a global level, particularly on issues like water. So the First Nations peoples are finding it very hard to exercise sovereign rights without continuous and consistent harm to people and country. And negotiation under native title legislation and practice does not equate to destruction of sites and cultures. It's not meant to, but it does. And that's how it's been played out since day one of having native title legislation in this country. It has equated to the destruction of sites and culture. So again, best practice is very questionable. And the social license to operate that we've heard consistently as part of the language, the rhetoric that's been used, particularly around the waste dump proposal in South Australia, initially at Wallabadina and now at Kimber. The social license to operate has always hinged on monetary gain. And I'm absolutely shocked to hear that the donation that the federal government are now making to the Kimber proposal for a waste repository also involves a $3 million contribution from the federal government that comes out of the indigenous advancement scheme. That's the federal bucket of money that's supposed to be there to support Indigenous Australians in self-determining their own form of development in this country. But here it is being siphoned off to support the nuclear industry and the ongoing push for a nuclear waste facility. So really shocking stuff. So a little bit here about the commoditisation, a little bit more about the commoditisation of people, land and culture, and how the colonial practices against Adnyamathanha have been unashamedly part of a relationship between an Australian company and General Atomics in the US. The native title law and practice, as I said, has failed to negotiate in a fair and just way for traditional owners, for native title holders. And we've consistently seen the use of armed police and staff force presence, detaining people unlawfully at protest sites. And particularly as Adnyamathanha women, we've been subjected to a great deal of intimidation, not only from industry and government, but sadly also from some of our own community who've taken it upon themselves to side with the mining industry because of the money and the power that's attached to it, and have also taken on board the idea that patriarchal domination is acceptable. Where we come from a very strong women's line of descent, we don't take kindly at all to being put down by our men or any other men. So intimidation is something they can keep trying, and they will, but we're definitely not going to let them get away with it. So Adnyamathanha knowledge of Vasini, of the poison that exists in our country, that we respect as being part of our country and part of our identity, takes us back to Yurramutta and what that means. And in this context, Yurramutta represents the vomit from a spiritual being. a godlike creator called Vidnimuru, who's said to have created the physical landscape up through the Beverley Mine and Mount Painter region. And the vomit or the sickness that was experienced by Vidnimuru is the green substance, the uranium. And it was near Mount Painter and Mount G where Vidnimuru died, and that's his resting place. So Mount G is actually the head of Vidnimuru laying down on his side, and that's the mountain that Marathon Resources wanted to drill a tunnel through so that they could link it up with the existing infrastructure at Beverley Mine. Well, thankfully we were able to stop that, and largely it was because of the persistence of Mura. And of course, Mura for us is our deep, strong connection between land and people, and also the responsibility that we have. If land is going to look after us, we have to look after land. But we know that our Mura tells us everything we need to know about all of these things that are now regarded as minerals, as commodities that can be exploited by mining industry, by government, and by greedy people in the community. And so, as I mentioned before, the women are the strong ones. The women are the ones who've got the guts to stand up, to keep fighting, and to not be wooed by the money or the power. And we see this everywhere we go across Australia. At the meetings such as the Australian Nuclear Free Alliance meeting in Horn, the township in the Flinders Ranges, where we've met several times, we see the women at the forefront of this fight every single time. And on the left side of the screen, you see two of my mothers there, one of my aunties, and one of my cousins. On the right-hand side, the women who came down, who were part of the fight against Muckaty. So they fought and won their battle to stop Muckaty Station becoming a waste dump, and they've continued to join in with us and to support us in our fight as we continue. And one of those fights, again, with Auntie Linda there and the leaseholder from Arkaroola, Marg Sprigg, we formed a very strong alliance that's based on several generations of family working together and supporting each other. And we decided, yes, we could work together, and yes, we could win this fight if we stuck to our guns about wanting to ban mining across the Arkaroola lease and preventing Mount G from being drilled to create a tunnel joining up to the old existing infrastructure. So we won our battle after several years. From 2008 to 2011, we fought this and won it, thankfully, where we were able to formulate the Arkaroola Protection Act. And myself and Mark Parnell from the Greens in South Australia, and also a lawyer that I'd been working with previously, between the three of us, we put up a good, strong piece of legislation, and we had it passed. The Arkaroola Protection Bill was passed. So now we have a blanket protection, no more mining, and we do have in place an Arkaroola management plan now. So this is one of the few battles that we've won, but we know that wherever we are, we have to tread lightly. And me living here in Melbourne, often I feel like I'm very distant from that. But a while back, I went to the climate action rally that took place here in the heart of Melbourne, and it was a very big rally. It was huge, and across the crowd, somehow I spotted this. And you'll see in the image here, this is an image of Yurlu. Yurlu is the kingfisher, and Yurlu is the leader of ceremony according to our Mura. And Yurlu is the one who lit the fires through the forest area in our country to let people know that he was travelling through the country to begin the ceremonies. And that's what created the coal. So we have a Mura for everything. We have a Mura for the uranium. We have a Mura for the coal. And so when this is destroyed or disturbed, so too is our culture, and so too is our sense of well-being and belonging to the country. And I've just got some further reading here. I won't go through all of that right now because there's a couple of pages of it, but I will stop sharing now.
Thank you very much, Gillian. That was great. And yeah, hopefully we can maybe share some of those links with people after the event if they'd like. I'm going to let Daniel come straight in, and then we'll do a Q&A with the both of you at the end. Cheers, Daniel. I think you might possibly be muted still, Daniel.
Can we hear me now? Is that okay?
That's perfect. I can hear you now. Thank you.
Great. I hope we can see some of these images as well.
Yep, we can see those.
Great. So I wanted to, firstly start by thanking Iona Glasgow CND for the invitation to join this event, putting together really informative and engaging series of discussions. It's been a real privilege so far this morning to be able to listen, learn, and think with and alongside you all today. And I'm really grateful to my co-panelists, Dr. Gillian Marsh for her presentation, and Lynn and Auntie Sue and Dave as well. Obviously, we know, and as has been explained already, that the stakes could not be higher in this discussions that we're having, and the nexus or relationship between genocide and ecocide that crystallizes at every sort of root and branch of the nuclear supply chain, from Hiroshima and Nagasaki to the Pacific Islands, the Algerian Sahara, and First Nations land in Australia, as well as to the mines where uranium ore is extracted before being processed into yellow cake, converted into hexafluoride, and then pressed and enriched into fuel. And this short presentation, or hopefully short, is going to focus on one of these extractive zones at the base of these nuclear systems. And I'm mostly going to be talking about a mine called Rössing, which was infamously operated by an Anglo-Australian mining company called Rio Tinto, and became an emblem of colonialism in the Namibian liberation struggle. And that's the Rössing mine that you can see on that photo there. It may, I'm sure, be a history that many of you are familiar with, but it's also a history that connects to my own, and which brought me to this work with the London Mining Network. Through specific but connected processes of racialization, colonialism, and capitalist expansion, when many Jewish families were fleeing pogroms and persecution in Europe at the turn of the 20th century, some, like my own, traveled further than others to settle in southern Africa, following in the footsteps of Anglo-Boer conquests for diamonds, gold, and other natural resources, including uranium. My grandfather was born in Cape Town to a family that experienced the peril of anti-Semitism as well as the privileges of whiteness in an African settler colony. But like many others, he joined the anti-apartheid movement, to which he committed his life in South Africa and in exile, where he convened international conferences on sanctions against South Africa and Southwest Africa, which would become Namibia. This legacy, as well as my own involvement in the campaign for justice and reparations following the massacres of 34 mine workers on strike for a living wage at Lunmin's platinum mine in Marikana on August the 16th, 2012, almost 2 decades after the end of apartheid, continues to move me towards the questions of settler colonialism and British imperialism in Southern Africa. And that's where I'm going to return back to Rio Tinto's Rössing uranium mine in Namibia. And I'm going to be drawing particularly on Gabriel Hecht's really excellent book, Being Nuclear, Africans in the Global Uranium Trade, which highlights really importantly how uranium from Africa has long been a major source of fuel for nuclear power and atomic weapons, including the Shinkolobwe mine in the Belgian Congo after a holocaust of 10 million people, which paved the way to Hiroshima. Alongside really significant research on French uranium imperialism in Niger, Gabon, and Madagascar, Hecht explores Southern Africa as this point of collision in the global nuclear order, Cold War capitalism and anti-communism, as well as, of course, anti-colonial struggle. Russing is in the heart of the Namib Desert. It's the longest running and one of the largest open pit uranium mines in the world. Due to its low grade, extracting around 1,000 tons of uranium in Russing translates into 3 million tons of radioactive waste ore. The prospect of mining uranium always promised to transform rural desert communities into radioactive landscapes and sacrifice zones under what Dr. Gillian referred to as this wasteland mentality. As outdoor livelihoods became increasingly exposed to dusty winds transporting radioactive particles from toxic mine tailings. And the Namib Desert only receives around 5 to 10 inches of annual rainfall, relies on aquifers and intermittent rivers for its water supply. And these are now increasingly filtered through contaminated sands. And while the mantra of jobs and employment is often relied on by management and marketing to push forward destructive mining projects, Hecht's work traces how workers in uranium mines are exposed to higher levels or higher amounts of internal radiation than any other segment in the nuclear energy industry, although they are frequently provided with the least amount of protective equipment and the fewest and least stringent health and safety regulations and rights at work. So Rio Tinto secured the loans it needed to develop Namibia's uranium with 2 advanced contracts from the UK Atomic Energy Authority for 7,500 tons of yellowcake. And this was sort of happening at a similar time to what Lynn was describing as a thawing or a distancing between UK and North American nuclear weapons programs, which have since coalesced again. But because Namibia was at the time occupied by apartheid South Africa and operated by Rio Tinto, a British Australian mining company, Russing was as close as Britain would come to controlling its own uranium supply. And on the other hand, it also enabled apartheid elites in Southern Africa to evade transnational demands for boycotts and sanctions by invoking the market as a purportedly neutral or depoliticized space. And the company, or well, Rio Tinto's attitude towards land stewardship, including First Nations and African self-determination and sovereignty, is perhaps best summed up by a remark made by a Rio Tinto shareholder at the meeting, or I think he was a chair of one of their subsidiaries, who said that the right to land depends on the ability to defend it. And another really important book is this by Henny van Vuren called Apartheid, Guns and Money. And it details how the kind of asymmetries in military power were consciously maintained during the apartheid era to ensure that that ability to defend land would always be eclipsed by superior military might from the apartheid state, supported by its international allies. Thatcher's government, of course, resolutely opposed sanctions and classified the ANC as a typical terrorist organization, while apartheid South Africa became the largest arms exporter on the continent and spent over 1/3 of its GDP on the war economy. And although the UK eventually and reluctantly supported an arms embargo in public, military intelligence was still covertly exchanged, and at least 87 arms contracts were made by British company in violation of international sanctions, including Lunro, which is the corporate ancestor of Lunmin, which is at the center of the Marikana massacres. When the United Nations prohibited the extraction of natural resources from Namibia in 1974, Rio Tinto's chairman, Val Duncan, declared that the company was, quote, not prepared to take any notice of what the UN's saying, and the British government formally rejected the decree. And this was followed by other industrialized nations like Japan, which then went on to become Russing's largest customer. From the moment that the mine opened in 1976, Russing symbolizes the capitalist world's complicity in maintaining apartheid in Southern Africa. And so for the next decades, Russing continued to fuel bombs in Britain, reactors in Europe and Asia. And during the 1980s at UN hearings, it was established that the entire structure of the uranium market at the time depended on this illicit Southern African uranium ore, which accounted for up to half of net exports of uranium, and with the leader of that cartel, Rio Tinto Zinc, meeting around a quarter of global production alone. The production of uranium under what became known as South African conditions became a code for super exploited African labor. Russing claimed to be a deracialized workplace, but the housing remained segregated. Black employees lived in a company town in the middle of the desert called Arandis, which you can see on the left here, just a few kilometers from the mine in the closest proximity to those radioactive tailings. Whilst white employees commuted from subsidized housing in the coastal tourist destination 70 kilometers away called Swakopmund, which is on the right here. Russing's largely migrant workforce went on strike at the end of the 70s to protest their living and working conditions, which the General Secretary of the Mine Workers Union of Namibia asserted were the worst in the mining industry. But order for capital accumulation was readily restored by South African riot police alongside the mine security, who were equipped with submachine guns, automatic rifles, tear gas, and grenades. Police dogs were a common sight, especially on paydays, and political agitators were identified to the South African police. In this context, the Southwest Africa People's Organization, SWAPO, came to dominate the Namibian liberation struggle, and they declared the Russing mine to be illegal. While the Western anti-nuclear movement had often preferred to set its sights on high technology systems closer to home, SWAPO and anti-apartheid activists strategically highlighted uranium's role in illegal weapons programs and the specter of an apartheid atomic bomb to make Russing a target on a world stage. The campaign against Namibian uranium contracts was founded in 1977 under the Namibia Support Committee. It published important condemnations of Rio Tinto and British imperialism in Southern Africa, including the Russing File, which was the inside story of Britain's secret contracts for uranium, and a documentary called Follow the Yellow Cake Roads. Some of London Mining Network's predecessors, Mine Watch and Partisans, contributed to this public delegitimization of Rio Tinto through books like Plunder, which detailed the company's onslaughts against indigenous communities, workers, and the environment, including in Namibia. But I think it's important to note that this coalescence between anti-apartheid and anti-colonial struggles in Southern Africa and anti-nuclear and anti-mining movements here in the imperial core was not without friction. When SWAPO and the Namibian Support Committee organized seminars for trade unions in the UK to build support for the liberation struggle, shop stewards at British Nuclear Fuels' Springfields plant, which converted and enriched Russing's uranium, were much more worried about job losses and thwarted a national trade union blockade. At this time, much of Russing's yellow cake was being moved in unlabeled containers through European planes, ships, docks, and roads, or was being labeled as British in origin via front companies like RTZ Minserv. And this was also being unknowingly handled by transport workers. However, by the end of the 80s, Britain's Transport and General Workers Union had spoken out emphatically against Namibian uranium imports, and dock workers in Liverpool were refusing to handle it. Unfortunately, by this point as well, Rio Tinto were making informal approaches to SWAPO leaders, and as soon as Namibia's independence accord was signed in March 1990, Rio Tinto began using it as a tool to lure more customers to Namibia, arguing that buying Russing uranium was now a moral investment in the future of an independent Namibia. And I think Sweden and Sweden's nuclear energy industry was particularly attentive to this. Instead of being nationalized, Rio Tinto increased its share in Rössing from just over 50% to 69%, with the Namibian government on just 3% of shares from the mine. Up until 2017, Rio Tinto was still extracting up to 1,500 tons of uranium from Rössing, but in 2019, it sold its entire interest in the mine to the China National Uranium Corporation for up to 106.5 million. In the wake of one of the world's biggest polluters exiting Rössing, the Namib's water sources remain heavily depleted. While the mine has inbuilt desalination plants and pipelines, the communities in Namibia are experiencing more frequent and extreme droughts and water insecurity due to climate change. So to conclude and open the discussion up, because I'm very keen to hear my other co-panelists' thoughts on this, I want to think about why it's important, or why I think it's important that we remember Rössing today and draw lessons from it. Firstly, and in relation to the sort of Marshall Mining report that we wrote and published at London Mining Network, despite the specificities of the struggles at Rössing, at a structural level, it's important to emphasize that there is nothing exceptional about London's role as a global capital for organized violence through the military and the arms trade, as well as the mining industry, and Rössing very clearly illuminates this. The relationship between these industries of destruction and devastation is evident, and arguably there's nowhere where this is clearer than with uranium. Britain's nuclear arsenal has relied to a significant degree on a steady accumulation of uranium from Rössing. It is no coincidence that the World Nuclear Association, representing, I think, up to 70% of the world's nuclear power and the vast majority of the world's uranium conversion and enrichment production, is based here in London, where I'm living today. But the other side of that equation is equally pertinent to us and the communities we work with at London Mining Network around the world, who know intimately that mega mining corporations could not possibly remove them from their lands, contaminate rivers and soils, and plunder vast sums of wealth while entrenching local inequalities without brutal military force. And the Marshall mining cycle is sort of describing this interdependence between the mining industry and the arms trades at different levels. And secondly, I'm also interested in what lessons we can learn about transnational solidarity and resistance, as Iona mentioned, as a sort of oppositional antidote to these structures of violence. And the ways in which, alongside their atrocities, which are undeniable, mines like Rössing can provoke generative connections between the struggles against extractive violence, be that uranium, copper, or cobalt mines, as well as the struggles against war, militarism, and nuclear weapons. And I'm interested in thinking about how we can kind of replenish these or renew these reservoirs of resistance in our movement history with the urgency that the present situation requires, how we can learn from these struggles with critical care rather than romanticized nostalgia, and how we can do this work across vast structural asymmetries of power around the world, yet acute common interests. These are questions that I'm grappling with, and I'd love to hear Gillian and my co-panelists and audience thoughts on these questions too. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Daniel. Yeah, we've got about 10 minutes left in this session. So if there are any questions in the chat that we don't get to today, again, I will email them out to you. But in the meantime, feel free to pop your questions into the chat or the Q&A box, and I'll let some of our other speakers respond to you.
Yeah, Daniel, if I might start a response, that was a really compelling presentation. Thanks very much. And I think your questions are really critical. There's a couple of specific points of intersection with what you've raised and what activists in Australia are working on and engage with. One is that Rio Tinto now are actively involved in a very significant rehabilitation work of Australia's longest running uranium mine, which closed in January of this year, January 2021. And that's a good news story. That's a massive tribute to the resistance of the Mirarr traditional owners who have always opposed that project. It's the Ranger mine in Kakadu. And it's a very significant cleanup, and Rio Tinto have been, like, our whole approach is to say that they'll be closely watched and long judged on how they conduct themselves. The second point is that Rio Tinto have, and many listeners will be aware, with the single biggest cash generator of the Rio Group is their iron ore operations in Western Australia. And they were recently involved in a massive exercise in cultural destruction with the Juukan Gorge, the destruction of Juukan Gorge, which has sparked a very significant conversation about how Aboriginal heritage is protected or not protected in this country. And the third area is that you're speaking about an area like uranium in Africa is where we see often junior Australian companies, Deep Yellow, Paladin Energy and others in Namibia, Malawi, Botswana and elsewhere, increasingly moving as the resistance is high in Australia. They're moving to areas of lower governance. And so that movement of transnational capital and the sort of osmosis movement to areas of lower governance is a real concern for us as well. So there's a body of specific work and broader themes that your words really resonated with me.
Yeah, thanks, Dave. Yeah, something I'd like to add to that. Yeah, Daniel, as you were speaking, I could see lots of parallels with the experiences that Indigenous people have here in Australia with what you were describing in Africa. And it brought me back to the time when I went for a visit to the Philippines and was talking with and listening to people from the Philippines talking. And we were specifically talking around what Western Mining Corporation and Rio Tinto were doing globally and what an impact they were having, you know, and how devastating it was on Indigenous peoples. And I think one of the most shocking things that became apparent to everybody there, because there were people there from many countries, was that what we are experiencing here in Australia varies very little to what's happening in other countries. Even though we might seem to have better legislative frameworks or better government regulatory processes, those regulatory processes and those government frameworks are not working. They were not designed to work to protect the environment. They were not designed to protect the sovereign rights of the Indigenous peoples here in Australia. And what's been put into practice is very, very little to what is happening globally. So things like water, for instance, the underground water table here in Australia is incredibly valuable, particularly to communities inland, and always have been for thousands of generations of people. That's why we have such a strong spiritual affiliation with the cosmology around how those water channels were formed. So as Indigenous people, we really value the spiritual understanding we have from the point of view that that's what we know we have to do to sustain the supply, the ongoing supply of good, clean water. When the Beverley mine was established and the impact assessment was taking place, one of the things that became very frustrating and very apparent to us all was that the requirement by industry standards was that you didn't have to rehabilitate the water. As you extracted the water from the ore body, took the ore out, you could pump the wastewater straight back into the underground water table. no requirement at all to rehabilitate it. And government and industry were absolutely solid on that. And we found out, you know, over the course of the process of inquiring about this, that even in countries, in places like Kazakhstan, were rehabilitating the water. They were required to, they had to do it, it was mandatory, not here in Australia. And it didn't matter what we said, it didn't matter how many times we pointed that out, it just got completely ignored. So now our underground water table is steadily but surely being polluted and contaminated with all the byproducts from what Beverley Mine are doing. And there's nothing we can do about it. And yeah, I think so. There's lots of parallels that that we can work on and you know, work through together. So I just wanted to make it really clear to everybody in this panel, you know, particularly those people who are here in Australia, don't think that in Australia we're any better off than what a lot of nations with far less civil and human rights are, you know, experiencing. We're not. Our human and indigenous rights and the rights of the environment in this country are no better than third world standards. So we are definitely all in this together. We have to work on the basis that there aren't any stronger legislative frameworks or practices in place, even in countries where we think there might be.
Thank you very much, Gillian. And I wanted to just pick up on as well, and that you made me think of something that hadn't necessarily been at the front of my mind as well when you picked up on this concept of language as part of your presentation. That again, we struggle with the exact same thing. I think when we're talking about nuclear weapons and the language that kind of gets used to keep everything running and keep everything in place, and sort of used to essentially, yeah, the language is designed to get people to shut up, essentially. And yeah, it's just one more tool in their arsenal. So thank you for picking up on that. We've got like 2-3 minutes until we go for our break. So I'm just going to see if there's any questions for either Gillian or for Daniel. Please pop them in the chat now. And if they're quick, we can get them answered. And if not, we can email them out to everybody after the event. If nothing comes through, we can begin our break, and you can have 12 minutes instead of 10. Thank you very much to Gillian and to Daniel. And after the break, we're going to hear from Ian Fairley and Jim Green.